right? So now today we will kind of look at England and English architecture and see that process in the, what happened in England is true for other countries as well. So they all experienced to some extent other kind of European countries like France, like Italy, like Germany. They all experienced a similar similar historical development, from the Roman Imperial the Renaissance revival of the classical past, and then the formulation of identity and gradual achieving that kind of national unity. And that national unity was pretty much defined by the linguistic similarity, the people who speak the same language and gradually they formulate into the same nation state. This formulation of modern nation state is part of the European history. And so England like in the medieval period, English architecture share with other medieval European architecture in the construction of castles and the cathedral in the 13th century and after. During what we might consider the Renaissance period, English architecture was also transformed from those kind of vertical medieval castle into the architecture that highlight horizontality and highlighting classical order, etc. So this one from the 16th century by Robert Smithson and was considered as the Renaissance architecture, Renaissance style in England, which can be compared to for example, the royal residence in France, the chateau, constructed during the same period that also start to highlight those horizontality on the facade, creating a quite different character compared to the Gothic verticality. And so this is the Italian influence in the 16th century in other European country. The Baroque period English architecture was pretty much influenced by the kind of court designer Inigo Jones, who served Queen Anne and creating what became known as the Queen Anne style. And the Queen Anne style in architecture is a Baroque expression. So we see that England during these centuries was not the initiator of fashion or architectural style, rather waves of influence from other country, from France and from Italy, were find a kind of a local expression in England. Inigo Jones, although he was living during the Baroque period, his architecture kind of can be characterized more as a kind of Palladianism, Palladian architecture in England. So his design has more characteristic of a late Renaissance. like this building, the banqueting hall. You can see clear the Palladian standardization using the classical order, and also the late Renaissance feature, like the using of kind of double column or double pilaster. A fairly kind of a banal facade. However, we can see it was divided into a tripartite composition, highlighting the center. The central columns are in engaged column, which is in round, and then the side bays are covered with pilaster, which are just elevated flat surface. So there's no real kind of architectural change on the facade. It's only decorative change. However, it created that classical tripartite division, highlighting a center, highlighting symmetry, like what we see in Palladio's design. For example, this is a Palladian building, a palace. So you can see the similarity, the emphasis on the center. And in Palladio, it is more architectural, and in Jung's building, it is kind of more superficial, maybe you can say. That the interior, Inigo Jones' building. So I'm going to move faster because this is really a parallel to what we looked at before. But before we mainly focus on the origin of these architectural change. For Gothic, it is in France, and for Renaissance and Palladianism, it was in Italy. Well, there was no Italy then. It was in Florence, in Venice, in Rome, etc. But here, those represent the time spirit, and were picked up by different European countries. So Inigo Jones' interior, we see a strong classical order as well. His use of these classical order. At that time, this is something really modern, because we have to understand before that it was the medieval castle and the Gothic kind of spires that was in the architectural fashion. The true kind of Baroque spirit that was carried to England was by a very famous architect, Christopher Wren. And Christopher Wren was living in the late 17th century and early 18th century. And we know the Baroque, the golden age of Baroque, or if we can call it kind of classic Baroque, that was 17th century. So other countries other than Italy, Baroque architecture started a little bit late, which is of course very understandable. So Christopher Wren was living in an age of great scientific breakthrough. So we know that great scientists like Newton, whose achievement was mainly made in the 17th century. So 17th century, we see in the field of science, great breakthrough, and which initiated a pan-European phenomena that eventually became known as the time of Enlightenment, that characterized much of 18th century. So 18th century was a century under the influence of those scientific discovery. So for which the world is rational, and trying to explain and trying to understand the world based on the scientific principles of rational thinking became a fashion, became influential. And everything associated with faith, with kind of a specific local tradition, regionalism, were considered as belonging to the past. So in the 18th century, instead of going to the Bible for truth, one was encouraged to, based on one's observation, go into science for truth. So that was a very important change, a very significant change. Christopher Wren was living in this transitional period. So he catched up a little bit of those excitement of the scientific discovery of Newton. And he was also experiencing the age of enlightenment when those great philosophers in other part of Europe, especially in France and in his own country, England as well. So he was a royal surveyor to King Charles II, and he was kind of a Renaissance man. He was living in the Baroque age and the age of disunion, but he was multi-talented, and multi-talent in the 17th and 18th century means he was also some kind of scientist and engineer, so, and an architect. So as a surveyor, he was responsible for helping the royal estate, taking care of those major engineering work of the kingdom, as well as designing specific architectural project. So living in the under the time spirit, the primary question for architect, not only for Christopher Wren, is can architecture be considered a science that obeys mathematically defined natural laws? So this has been a debate in the architectural circle, and Christopher Wren was part of that kind of discourse, trying to fit architecture to question of the time. And who were the meet regularly, and they had, and the example Cook, who is known primarily for his invention of the microscope, and also his invention of the terms. So he used the word cell to describe the basic unit of all
I guess I'll call him again. Nice.
sorry about that again. All right, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good, thank you. Okay, so so in fact, the term cell was first used in architecture, and then it was Hooke who adopted it to describe the basic unit for living organism. So this example, I think it's quite telling, the case of Hooke, for two things. One, in 17th to 18th century England, architecture and science are very related, very connected, and there were the same group of people who are interested in both science and architecture. And secondly, the thinking about architecture, the aim for architecture, what considered as good architecture during this period was meant to somehow be similar to those great scientific discovery, like what those made by Newton. So Christopher Wren, who was practicing during this period, he actually visited France, and he saw those Baroque design by, for example, by Mansart, and Mansart's design in Paris, the Dome of Invalides, was the first example. So this is a building in Paris, designed in completed in 1677 under Louis XIV, and this is the first dome that has 3 layers. This building, which was kind of working in the same way, since highlighting the dome, ever since Brunelleschi elevated the dome to such a high level of artistic achievement. Before that, before Brunelleschi, dome had never been enjoying such a status as the pinnacle of a building. In Pantheon, those domes were basically invisible. But ever since Brunelleschi did it, domes started to become a very prominent part of European architecture. So Mansart's building was working in that spirit, like Michelangelo was trying to do, but eventually became hidden during by the Counter-Reformation movement in Italy. So Mansart's building made that dome prominent, really, really prominent. And he also created a 3-layer dome. Before that, for example, the dome at St. Peter's, it has 2 layers. There is a masonry layer that is visible from the floor of the interior, and then there's a kind of a timber structured second layer to form the proper exterior image, the height of that dome. Mansart's dome had 3 layers. So in addition to the layer forming the dome structure, he also added an inner layer, and that inner layer had an oculus. So that part, the lower dome, is really like Pantheon, which also has an oculus. So Mozart's creation reflect the Baroque tendency for achieving kind of mysterious illumination for the interior, because with the oculus and with the paintings under that complete dome, let's call it a middle layer. So a more kind of three-dimensional spatial image was created for that heavenly scene painted under the middle layer of the dome. And also kind of small windows created at the base level of the middle dome create those mysterious illumination, illuminate that the dome painting, and making the appreciation from the ground level more interesting, and creating that kind of mysterious atmosphere for those images. So that was a great example, very inspiring for someone like Christopher Wren, and he would use these kind of a new strategy for architectural creation in his own work. In 1666, there was a great fire in London, destroying much of the urbanized area, and that kind of created an opportunity for Christopher Wren to totally rebuild the city of London. And a different architect provided different scheme, different proposal. For example, this is Christopher Wren's plan for the reconstruction of London. And in this plan, we can observe the Baroque spirit in urbanism. So he used a lot of, in addition to the grid, in addition to the grid, he also created a system of hub and connection. So he created those square and broad avenue connecting those urban hub. And some of those were cutting through the urban fabric diagonally. So this is a Baroque planning feature initiated in the reconstruction of Rome for Counter-Reformation purposes. And we can also observe such a Baroque design in the planning of the Versailles Palace in France. So Christopher Wren's plan for the reconstruction of London certainly reflect that Baroque spirit. And there are other proposals as well. Robert Hooke also made his own proposal for which, the imagined future for London looks more like an organism, not as grand as what Christopher Wren imagined under the kind of Baroque spirit. The actual reconstruction was not following any of those great proposal. All those great proposal to some extent are kind of some sort of utopia. And the actual carrying out follow, a much smaller scale. Part of the reason is the legal reason. In the 17th century, the private property rights in England were already stronger than the political will. And So London was reconstructed little by little instead of using implementing a big scheme. So Sir Christopher Wren reconstructed many of those neighborhood churches, and so the reconstruction started with the creation of a community center, and in the 17th century that was the church. So he designed many of them, and these small churches were financed by the tax levied on the coal entering the city of London. So 17th century, late 17th century, early 18th century, that was also the beginning of the, what eventually became known as the Industrial Revolution. So first scientific discovery in the 17th century, and then eventually in the 18th century, the Great Industrial Revolution. So the fuel and the coals and all those major kind of energy sources was significant for the revenue of the urban community as well. So those churches were completed during a relatively shorter period of time after the Great Fire of 1666. But their lots are all different. They are located in different urban situation. So each church is different and does not rely on Italian or French model. So from these little community church in the reconstruction of London by Christopher Wren, we started to see a true kind of English character. And because of the uniqueness for each individual situation. And Christopher Wren blend both classical and Baroque into a new vernacular. And this new vernacular eventually had great impact on architecture of the New World, on American architecture. So these are some of the plans of the Christopher Wren's design. They are all different, but they all share also a great similarity. That is, all these churches features axiality. They all have some kind of axis created following the nave and altar orientation. So there's a central space terminated at the apse where the altar is located. So this is true for this one. It's also true for this one. And here's that direction. This one is more square, but still, this one is obvious here as well. So this is, of course, the Baroque highlighted that axiality, and the entrance was sometimes put at the other end of the axis, but sometimes not. For example, this one, you have to enter from the corner and kind of make that transition. The entrance is combined with the bell tower. Right, so you see that very thick wall, thick piers, that is often located at the entrance, because the entrance is often located under the tower, under the bell tower. And in all of his small church design, they are all kind of a single tower, one tower, instead of the twin tower in the Gothic cathedral. So here in these little community churches, it's all just a singular tower combined with the entrance and formulating the beginning of the axial interior space. And he also sometimes, when it is possible, he creates a centrality in the interior as well. Like in this case, there's a dome, and here a dome as well. And there we have that kind of a, well, it's octagonal, but can be fit inside an oval shape. So all these also reflect the kind of Baroque spirit in architectural design. So this is the in the interior. So there's the axiality can be observed here, and Christopher Wren believes in the Reformed religion rather than the Catholic. He believed that this smaller church that allow people to not only see but also hear better is very important. He said it should seem that who are present can both hear and see, whilst for Catholics it is enough if they hear the murmur of the mass and see the elevation of the host. So basically, for the Reformed Church, the Reformed Church, the Christopher Wren's churches are mostly for the Reformed Church. The English Church, by his time, was already kind of separate from the Catholic Rome. For the Reformed Church, the Anglican, or the Calvin, the church was more like a classroom. It's more for teaching. To hear the words by the priest was very important. The information exchange between the audience and the priests was important because it highlight some kind of a personal interpretation of the Bible. So it's like the study of Bible, looking into the Bible to understand life and for truth, which is very different from the Catholic cathedral, for which the ritual activity was most important. And in that case, the Gothic cathedral was not a classroom. Gothic cathedral was a space for ritual. The great echo and the sound of the organ make the words incomprehensible. So what Christopher Wren was creating is kind of smaller scale and making it into an environment that is not only visually but also acoustically clear. So he designed a variety of those spires, of those steeples, right? That is, usually combined with the entrance. And here I'm showing you a variety of those churches design, steeples designed by Christopher Wren. And the certainly kind of blend the late Renaissance classicism as well as the current Baroque spirit. The steeples have the sharp verticality like those Gothic towers. However, they were divided into small sections, and each of them are like a classical pavilion, a little classical temple. So for example, here you can obviously see this order, and with its own pediment, and in this case it is segmental, it's arched. And on top of it, you have another kind of classical pavilion and yet another, right? So he piled up those classical pavilion into a vertical tower. And sometimes he quote those domical structure and making the top of the steeple like a lantern pavilion on top of a large dome. And the curves and the broken pediments shows the Baroque spirit. So you can see here the classical elements were broke into sections and making part of them protruding out and part of them recessing. And or, you know, in this case, an arch is breaking the entablature into separate parts. So all those manipulation and dissecting and recomposing of those classical motif was inspired or inherited the previous architectural development in late Renaissance, in Mannerism, and in the recent Baroque. So this is the St. Stephen in Walbrook, designed by Christopher Wren. So the lot is a corner lot at a T intersection. So this is also very important for the understanding of Christopher Wren's design, like the Baroque church in Italy. So these churches are not in the middle of an empty square, but, you know, fit into an urban block. So their facade are only partially visible, and specifically designing those visible part is a key strategy for these small church design. So in this case, the tower was designed into a major scenery in the streetscape. So at the other end of the street, you can see that tower, and you find the entrance, and you enter the church. So all these look so familiar because this is exactly what those Boston church are designed, and those churches in Boston. The direct source was Christopher Wren, right? So that's the direct model for the Old South Church, Old North Church, and also the King's Chapel in Boston. So the interior, the entrance is just next to the tower, and the entrance is lined up with the axis facing the altar. And Christopher Wren created a dome, and for these small churches, the dome was constructed in wood. So it's a wooden dome, and that wooden dome created a vertical upward drawing in the interior without sacrificing the axiality for the ritual purposes. And that dome also reflect some kind of Renaissance spirit. And then the lantern pavilion create a circular kind of light in the middle of the dome, and that is Baroque. So you find all those inspirations in his design, but you don't see this in other part of Europe before. So it's a kind of a British creation and a formulation of a kind of national identity in architecture, and eventually it would influence the New World. So this is the interior. it's quite spacious. So he eliminated a few columns to create that octagon for the dome. He was able to do that because the roof was wooden. It was not a masonry roof, and it is kind of relatively light. And that lightweight also allowed him to open window under those arches. So on each side he put an arch. We can see here put an arch, and so that those pendentives are much smaller. So instead of 4, so here he has 8 pendentive rising from a octagon. So like Baroque architecture in Italy, again, he is combining the principle of squinch and pendentive. So he transforms square into octagon, but from the octagon, he still use pendentive to make a perfect round edge for the supporting base. And he opened window inside those, under those pendentives, and the lightweight make that possible of the dome, make the opening of those large windows possible. So his interior has a great sense of spaciousness and bright, without those kind of mysterious lighting effect of both medieval cathedrals and the Italian Baroque. So show greater detail of these kind of bright space under the dome. And then of course in the middle of the dome there's still that bright circular light, creating that vertical upward movement in the interior. So we certainly see some inspiration from Baroque, but in English architecture it was more classical. It was, here, instead of mysticism created by that light, you find a perfect geometry in that light. You find some kind of classical order. So here, classicism, Baroque, and a local interpretation of both was combined into a unique architectural, architectural prose, and that is the kind of English identity created by Christopher Wren. And his most famous work is the St. Paul Cathedral, which was burned in the London fire. And that cathedral was a Gothic, of course. That was a Gothic cathedral with those central towers and a lot of smaller towers and all those verticality. Christopher Wren, like Michelangelo, first also proposed the kind of centralized plan, a concentric plan. And that was not well received. And he changed to what he called the great model, which is, like the expansion of Michelangelo's design by Maderno, kind of extend from that centralized plan a few bays toward the entrance, and thus creating a Latin cross. But this one, the dome he proposed was too enormous, and it was not very practical to achieve. It was bigger than St. Peter's dome, and the final design that eventually was adopted, more or less, adopted, but with some change. It's called the Warrant Plan, and that one looks a lot more similar to the original Gothic church in comparison to the previous two plans made by Wren. And also has the unmistakable Latin cross in its plan. So he still put a dome at the crossing, but much smaller compared to the previous proposal. So this one, the small scale of the base helped to scale down the centralized space, and thus made the building of the project more feasible. So this is the plan that eventually was built. In addition to a central dome at the main crossing, he put a series of smaller domes at different locations as well. At the narthex, the entrance, transitional space for the entrance. So he kind of created a secondary Latin cross there. And he also put small domical ceiling in the aisle, which is quite innovative. And at the transept arms, he also put those smaller domes as well. So dome became a main unifying theme, kind of compromising the otherwise very Gothic plan of Latin cross. So that dome kind of replaced the tower, the Gothic tower, at those kind of characteristic featuring locations. The interior, right? So here we have in the nave, looking toward the apse, and the bright light coming down from that crossing where the largest dome is located. And classical geometric arch, replacing those pointed arch from the medieval period, and the horizontality from the Renaissance architecture was broken kind of by the new Baroque spirit. So you see it goes in and out instead of forming that straight line. The interior is also very spacious and very bright as well. The windows are opened on the clerestory level, illuminating the interior, and the whitewashed ceiling helped to reflect the light better than those colorful and often dark murals in other churches. So this is the look from the air. Much of those small domes are covered under the second layer of timber roofs, and thus became invisible. And the dome at the central crossing looming up around 2 layers of drum, continued the tradition initiated by Brunelleschi, carried out in St. Peter's by Michelangelo, and then in Mozart's Invalides, and now Christopher Wren's St. Paul. So we have this kind of a lineage of monumental dome construction after the Renaissance. So Christopher Wren's Sympath Cathedral is a compromise between Baroque and Renaissance classicism. So the Baroque spirit can be observed in the manipulation of classical form, like those broken pediment and broken cornice, and a lot of curve created at the steeples, and also the Twin Tower, which is unmistakably a counter-Reformation effort, kind of calling back some of the medieval Gothic features. You know, Bernini was meant to put similar Twin Tower at St. Peter's, but he didn't achieve that. So Christopher Wren was successful to put that there. So there were some kind of back and forth in the struggle between the Reformed Christianity and Catholicism in England during this century. So it was not like one direction prevailing struggle that, you know, the Reformed church simply win. So there were a lot of struggle. And somehow Christopher Wren's St. Paul's Cathedral design had made more compromise to Catholicism by bringing back those Gothic-like towers and a lot of those Baroque features associated with counter-Reformation. Other Baroque feature can be observed in these kind of coupled columns, which is also, you know, counter kind of classical order does not have that irrational supporting. But other than those, the classical features are obvious. So here we have that pediment, like a Greek temple, fairly authentic Ionic order, other than the double column. And that dome is a perfect quotation and a salute to those high Renaissance masters like Michelangelo, like Bramante. So we have that kind of, again, the blending of those different historical sources. And also like Mozart's Invalides, Christopher Wren also created a tripartite dome. So there is a lower layer with an oculus. There is an outer layer constructed in wood to create the proper height for the dome. And then there is also a middle layer. And the middle layer have a lot of small oculus, and those small oculus allow the light to enter. And those light were very indirect, right? Very indirect, because first, the space in between the middle layer and outer layer are, you know, come from the drum come from there. Those windows made light into that space. And then those light were filtered through those small oculus and illuminate the space between the middle layer and the lower layer, right? So very indirect from the space of between the outer layer and the middle layer and into the space between the middle layer and lower layer. It was inspired by Hooke's great invention for the microscope, because for microscope, when you are observing a tiny organism, the light is very important. You must have the very even light. You don't want to have glare. Otherwise, you won't see anything, or you will misinterpret some light effect as the organism. So kind of scientific discovery and scientific engineering invention somehow also find their way into the design of architecture. The result is a interior that had a kind of indirect light sources and illuminating the interior and the ceiling, like what we have been emphasized in the Italian Baroque architecture. But here, there are more kind of classical geometry rather than the mysticism. And here we find in this light, instead of religious mysticism, we find scientific rationalism. And that's another way for Christopher Wren to combine all those previous great creations into his unique synthesis. And of course, there's another light source, and that is coming from above, coming from the Lantern Pavilion. But that light source have to also go through many layers to be visible from floor. Yeah, this is basically what that kind of scientific discovery inspired the creation of light effect for St. Paul. Another kind of scientific inspiration is the shape of the middle dome. So that shape is in the shape of a hanging chin. Scientific discovery had proved that for the shape of a hanging chin, as a result of a certain load put underneath, when you reverse it, it would be most efficient to carry the same load as the one that is resulted in that shape, right? So that's basically, Wren's theory. He claimed that the reason why he had that kind of unique, kind of hyperbolical shape, or parabolical. Well, that's more accurate. So that parabolical shape was a result of that kind of scientific calculation. So that weight, the weight of the Lantern Pavilion, if it is hanging down, would cause a chin to form that shape. That is his theory for that, for the creation of that shape. So you can see in the English 17th century and 18th century scientific architecture, they were believed to be, forming the same kind of a group of knowledge, and architecture was looking to those great scientific discovery for inspiration. And being compared to Newton or to those great inventions certainly is elevating the status of architectural practice and design. The same 18th century and 17th century also saw another aspect in English architecture, that is the so-called picturesque. So on one hand, we have those scientific rationalism in architecture. And on the other hand, there was a desire to create something that is surprising, that is exotic. And the 18th century British art was characterized by both. So in the picturesque, what became known as picturesque in architecture and garden, a appreciation of exotic was cultivated and was made in the garden and architecture to create surprise, to create some kind of a pleasure in spatial experience. So those exotic can be a result of remote culture, like those Chinese architecture, or remote place, far away, China, Japan, or the India, or other part of Europe. But it could also be remote in time. So it is in the picturesque, some medieval character was brought back again, and that is remote in time. So now in the 18th century, after 3 centuries of classical development since the Renaissance, medieval period seemed so remote, and they aroused certain kind of romantic imagination in people's mind, and they were brought back. Just like creating a Chinese pagoda, they are the expression of that appreciation of exotic for being remote from the reality of life, and they can be remote in both space and time, right? 18th century saw the European appreciation of the East, but also the kind of the Chinese appreciation of the exhaust West. So in the 18th century, there was an appreciation of exotic, not only in Europe, but also in China. A Chinese pagoda was constructed in England, and a European building was built in the Summer Palace, the old Summer Palace in Beijing, right? So it's constructed in the Baroque style. And both are facilitated by the great missionary communication between the two ends of the world, of the old world, right? Those missionaries brought the image of Europe to China and brought image of China to Europe. Thanks to the new invention of printmaking, the etching, lithography, which made the creation of image much faster and mass productable. That helped to trigger that mutual appreciation of exotic, right, in the 18th century. And this is the background of the picturesque architecture and garden. So this is the in China, right? It's in the Summer Palace. It was destroyed during the Second Opium War, but in this ruined situation, you can see clearly it is Baroque in style. And then in England, there was a great appreciation of Chinese garden whose writings by the missionaries talk about how surprising, how interesting Chinese garden is. So this is a Chinese garden, the Zhuozhengyuan, from the early 16th century. And of course, in reality, in a real garden, you barely find a pagoda like that. Even though at Zhuozhengyuan, there is a pagoda image borrowed from distance, that's called the borrowed view, right? And its reflection can be observed in this garden pool. In the 18th century, William Chambers built a Chinese pagoda, or what he believed is Chinese in style, in the Royal Botanic Garden in London. And the garden designer was Lancelot Brown, and the architect is William Chambers. So the pagoda is kind of inspired by an image of pagoda brought to England by the missionaries rather than a real pagoda, because you don't see a single bracket here, right? In a real pagoda, there should be a lot of brackets carved in bricks, and also there should be those carvings suggesting column and beams, etc. And those arches should be much smaller. So obviously, Chambers had never seen a real Chinese pagoda. He was more kind of copying in 3D a print brought to England. But who cares? It is the creation of an exotic image that trigger people's imagination of China, and that is enough. I think that is the same is true for the Western building built in Beijing in the 18th century. It was stone, it was not brick. It is not that authentically Baroque. It has those Baroque elements, but still the prominent curved roof looks very Chinese. But for the Manchu emperor, that is very exotic, with the combination with those fountains that utilize the 18th century cutting edge technology of hydraulic power. So picturesque garden contrast sharply with the Versailles, the French geometric garden, in its kind of a free design and use of organic shape and incorporating nature into the built environment. And that, in that sense, it is closer to the Chinese garden in the use of those kind of zigzag and indirect access to anywhere in those gardens. So here we have the French garden, and this is the British garden. So exotic can be triggered by a remote place like China, but also kind of a remote time. So some new construction were deliberately made like a ruin. So in this case, this looks like a Roman ruin, architectural ruin from the Roman time, and but in reality, it is a brand new construction in the 18th century. So that picturesque, of course, is a cultural phenomena. It is not only architectural. In painting, long before the 18th century England, some French artists had already been creating those picturesque style in painting that highlight those exotic, ruined condition for those Roman architecture. So you find those ruins here and there. So that's called picturesque in painting, just like mannerism first appear in painting and then in architecture. So the picturesque was also heralded by these painters. The contrast between the French garden and English garden can be observed in this pair. So on the left, we have Versailles. On the right is the Stowe Garden of Stowe in England, also designed by Lancelot Brown, and with architectural and interior design by William Kent. So the garden was without a unifying axis. So with those passages hidden behind the trees, and then the water body was not shaped into geometrical regular shapes. But similar to the French garden, the residential part, the palace, is located at one end, and the whole garden was created as a giant backyard, basically. So there, architecture dispersed within the garden tried to trigger surprise and trigger a imagination of exotic remoteness. So it could be a Roman structure. It could be a medieval, looks like a medieval ruin. And it also could be kind of a Palladian facade. Like that one looks especially like a Palladio design of a church with, you know, a slim, tall temple overlapping a low temple. And if you add a dome on top, it is a Palladio's church, right? And indeed, that pavilion is also very Palladian. But you find all kind of architecture here in this Garden of Stowe. We have a triumphal arch, a Greek temple like Parthenon, and there a Chinese pavilion. And of course, it's, you know, if someone coming from the Qing Empire, from China, they would have no idea that this is China. But for European, this is China, right? So it's it is created for a local audience. Whether it is authentic, that is not a question for the designer of these picturesque garden. And there, you know, we have a building that looks just like Palladio, right? So that one, like Villa Rotunda, or a part of a Palladio's villa. And that one looks very Renaissance. So those pavilions created in the Garden of Stowe it's like an architectural exhibition displaying different style. Some of them are more recent, some of them are remote in time or in space. And the idea is to create excitement and to give surprise for those touring visitors. And there, a bridge was created as if it was collapsing. And so here we have the medieval ruined cathedral. Looks like a Gothic church that has been falling apart. There's not much interior. Is looks like the roof had been falling down, with only the entrance facade surviving. So and again, it's a created dilapidated situation for architecture. So it's a new construction, but was made to trigger some imagination. So the past was romanticized. So picturesque was also the beginning of Romanticism that eventually would become very popular in the 19th century. So here we have a very Palladian bridge. A bridge looks like kind of Palladian facade built on top of a Roman ruin. And there we have that collapsing bridge, which is also a new construction. And that remind us like those created dropping parts in Romano's design of the Mannerist Palazzo del Te. This is another corner of the Stowe park. It is a park, right? The Stowe Garden, and rocks and sculptures representing, that looks like a ruined part of architecture, dotting the irregularly bordered water body in combination with the trees and the nature, create a sharp contrast to the great geometry, axiality, and clarity of those French garden design. So in the garden, in architecture as well, there is a tendency of kind of a picturesque, as represented by this Strawberry Hill residence by Horace Walpole in Twickenham near London. So this one was constructed section after section from the mid 18th century to 1777. So the facade were constructed featuring inconsistency, irregularity, asymmetry, and discontinuity. So there was no attempt to unify all different parts. It seems, there is a stylistic inconsistency, right? So some parts looks more classical, other parts looks like a medieval castle, and some vernacular kind of roofs, and they were dissected into different parts. Seems as if they were kind of put together ad hoc to form a group, but in reality it was designed so. So all these reflect the appreciation for surprise, for some kind of innovation for innovation's purpose, and connected with such a aesthetic tendency was the sense of kind of exotic, something that is exotic, that is unusual, that is not about normal daily life, and that is appreciated. So the interior, Horace designed this very famous interior, and that mimic the Gothic interior, showing the representing the ribbed vault, right? So a lot of ribs, but of course the difference is here in picturesque architecture, it is all fake. They are all surface decoration. They have no structural function whatsoever, while the Gothic ribbed vault are structural. So we find a coming back of Gothic So this is well on the path toward a Gothic revival, which eventually would be very popular in the 19th century, especially during Queen Victoria's reign. There was a Gothic revival known as Victorian Gothic in the 19th century, but Picturesque was preparing the ground for that new tendency in the following century. And so this is the interior. See the Gothic decoration on a fairly flat roof. So the roof is basically flat. All those were made in plaster. Right, thank you. And I think we can stop here.